The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette is facing national criticism after the Newspaper Guild says the paper removed two black journalists from covering the protests.
This is difficult. She's a young person. She stood up for what was right, and because of that, her career has been damaged. She's taken a stand. She's stuck up for something that's important.
Disappointed that I'm not out there covering these protests. When I put my cameras down and take my press badges off, I'm a black man in America.
A local anchor in Pittsburgh was fired after she posted stereotypical comments about black individuals on her public Facebook.
The nationwide discussion over racial inequality has people talking about another important issue in America: lack of diversity in the workplace. Are companies doing enough to make sure your atmosphere is inclusive?
Diversity, the state of being diverse, or its a variety. Newsroom, the area in a newspaper or broadcasting office where news is written and edited. Foster, encourage or promote the development of something, typically something regarded as good. Inclusive, the practice or policy of providing equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized, such as those having physical or intellectual disabilities or belonging to other minority groups. Racism, prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism by an individual, community, or institution against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. Hello, my name is Justin Stewart. Today's program will be told through the voices of 5 different people, each of whom has had their own unique perspective on the current climate regarding diversity in the newsrooms, news coverage pertaining to minority communities, and racism that has lurked in the shadows all of this time. Those people are Lynne Hayes-Freeland, who worked many years at KDKA TV and KDKA Radio, Dr. Ervin Dyer, a writer, journalist, adjunct professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and senior editor of the Pitt magazine, Miracle Jones, director of policy and advocacy at One Hood Media, Rob Taylor Jr., managing editor for the New Pittsburgh Courier and news update anchor on KDKA Radio as well, and Ben Schmitt, deputy managing editor at the Pittsburgh Tribune Review. Anyways, I hope whoever comes across this podcast feels a little bit more informed and educated and understanding of the experiences that people go through. No one experience is exactly the same. Without further ado, let's jump right into the conversation.
My journalism story is very non-traditional. So I grew up in Pittsburgh. I grew up in the Hill District. When I went to college, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was an accounting major because my mother was an accountant. And then I met a guy who was working at the radio station, and I was hanging out at the radio station with him. And I realized, oh, this is way more fun than accounting. So my junior year, I changed my major. Obviously, the relationship with the guy never went anywhere. He never got a job in journalism, but that relationship led me to what I think was ultimately my real calling in life. Probably from 77 to about 87, there were more African Americans in responsible positions in management and a variety of positions in the TV station. There were more then than there are now. We've gone backwards for sure. So back then, I mean, I was a kid, you know. I basically answered the phones for 6 hours a night and said, hello, this is the Fox's Den. What would you like to talk about? Please hold. Hello, this is the Fox's Den. And, you know, I mean, that's what I did. I didn't have any real responsibility. Nobody took me seriously. But I enjoyed the environment. I enjoyed being there. And it reconfirmed that this was the business that I wanted to be in. Ironically, I got fired from the job at KD Radio because they said I was reading the newspaper while I was on the job. I would have thought that being a talk show producer, they would want you to read the newspaper on the job. What I didn't know at the time was they wanted to give somebody else my job. I realize now in this business, people get fired and hired every day. It's no big deal. I think that a lot of the issues that were there in 77, I mean, when I look at KDKA Radio back then, there were no people of color on the air on the talk show side. I think there was a guy in the news department who did the news. a while after I left radio. Ben Schmitt did like a weekend show on KD Radio. But the realities are we still don't have a voice in that talk radio era of KD. When I went to KD Radio full time, I thought it was an opportunity to make a difference. I thought that being the first full-time African-American talk show host would bring new voices to the station, would bring new perspectives. I had no idea how hard that was going to be. It was exhausting, and I met with more obstacles in the 3 years that I was at KD Radio than I did in the 40 years I was in TV at KDKA. So one of the things that I ran into with a manager, so there was a struggle. Black listeners traditionally, in large numbers, weren't listening to KDKA radio. There was no reason to. And so I feel like I kind of just got dumped in the middle of this radio station. But what I found out one day in a meeting was one of my bosses, who is no longer there, said to me, well, what can you do to appeal to 50-year-old white males? That's our audience. And I said, well, if that's why you brought me here, then that's ridiculous. I'm not going to appeal to 50-year-old white males. But we just haven't had enough of a voice, I don't think, in that venue, in that atmosphere to really make a difference. I think at one time the FCC made sure that there was diversity, there were diverse faces, diverse voices. I also think that the community has changed. There was a time that the community was vocal, the Black community was vocal, and we picketed and we protested and we made sure that there were Black people on the anchor desk. There were Black people out in the field reporting, but the community is not that vocal anymore. Like people, even still, they write to me and say, hey, what's going on at KD? Hey, what's going on at 11? I'm like, you need to be asking them that. Don't ask me that. Ask them. I mean, I can remember a time at KDKA that the sales manager was Black. The promotions manager was Black. And the realities are, it is the managerial people in those roles that make the biggest impact, because they are the ones that hire. They are the ones that decide programming. They are the ones that decide news content, the news director, the executive producer. Whereas people knew us as the faces, but we had limited influence. I remember doing a story about a young man that was charged with a homicide. And the whole time I covered that story in the courtroom, who I saw sitting at that defendant's table was not that young man, but I saw my son. Because my son was like the same age, he had the same kind of build. And this kid the only bad mistake that he made was being in the car with his friends that were making bad decisions. But he was now paying the price for that. So I felt like the whole time I covered that trial, I covered it through that lens, that could have been my son. And when it was over, his grandmother came up to me and said, I just want to thank you for not making my grandson look like the animal that the other stations did. So I think it's that kind of thing that's what I think one of the things that we bring to the table. When you add diversity to the table, then you get a different perspective in the stories that are told.
I think there needs to be a real commitment to recruitment and a real commitment to understanding there's different communities that need to be covered. And it's sometimes helpful to have people who are part of those communities and look like those communities. So, yeah, I think they could do a better job. I think that when we don't regularly cover people's stories, right, then I think it silences so much of their humanity, right? How they contribute to society, the history of them as a people, their struggles, their achievements, their contributions to their families, to their societies. I think when we don't cover that regularly, people go silent, right? And there's a whole silence then that I think sort of blights a people's character and blights a people's history. And so that the people who are reading these newspapers and the people who are turning into these radio stations and the people who are turning into these news stories, if they don't get stories about Black people, that show the fullness of their lives, right, then they're never going to understand them as full human beings, how they contribute to society, that they have a history of achievement, a history of oppression, a history of, success, just like everybody else. You're not going to see them in a full sense of who they are. And so that sort of, to me, it blights their character, it blights their history, and it just diminishes, to me, a whole part of who they are. And I think that newspapers and journalists in particular have a responsibility to cover communities as fully as they can. That's part of truth telling, right? It's to talk about the whole community and not just only aspects of a community. And a lot of times, when it comes to marginalized communities, the communities of color, the mainstream newspapers they've just not been there. A lot of it is historical, right? So America, for better or for worse, there's there's segregation in America, and communities have been segregated. There's a racial divide, and communities, for better or worse in America, for far too long, have existed on these divides, right? So the Black community is one place, the white community is another place, and if you only come into a community when crime is happening, right, or when something disastrous is happening, and that's the only story you're telling, then the people who are reading your newspaper or the people who are listening to your broadcast, that's the only message they're getting about the community. So this idea then becomes reproduced that there's nothing in those communities except for what you're hearing about, right? So that begins to, again, to me, that blights, again, the community. It blights the people's character because it doesn't fully talk about who they are, right? At the same time there's crime happening, there's also family happening, there's church happening, there's people in the community trying to make a difference, right? Yeah, but we're not hearing those stories. And if you look at the white community, we always see that that's where the power structure is attached to because of segregation. And so often you have to cover that. But again, if that's the stories that you're getting about the white communities, that they're contributing in so many ways, then that's what you believe that they're doing. And that's what that becomes the image of who they are, people who contribute, people with all the power. And if you're not getting any of those stories from the African-American community, then you're not going to believe that they're doing any of those things. But they are. They have people who are making contributions. They have people who are engaged in politics. They have criminals, but that's not all. It's a part of the Black community. Every community has its bad elements, but they're not covered equally, and the weight of how they're covered is not the same. And so you create these images, you create these depictions, and people believe what they read and what they see. And so it becomes problematic if you're only seeing one thing. When we begin to hire more journalists of color and more people see us, right, in the community, on television, connected to the Post-Gazette or connected to whatever media we may be with, then they begin to think that that's also something that they can do, right? And so they have a model, right, and perhaps a pathway forward. So that's important. Representation is important. So I had gotten a grant, right, from the National Association of Black Journalists, and I spent just about a month in Africa covering what was then called independent churches. And so I came back to the newspaper and I wrote what I had experienced, right? And it was a new experience for me, and so I really worked with my editor to try to figure out what the story was and how to tell it. And it was a Sunday piece, a Sunday feature story, and the story ended up running at the bottom of the Sunday feature page. And I was a staff writer, I think, for the Post-Gazette. I've been a staff writer for the Post-Gazette for some time. And so my story ran at the bottom of the feature page, and at the top of the page was a story by a freelancer on bees. I think it was on bees, I can't remember. And so I remember just being very hurt by that. The editors or whoever made the decision to put the story at the bottom of the page didn't value the story enough or my experience enough that the story couldn't have more prominent display. And I'm not sure all of what went into that decision, but I felt, this is just me speaking personally, I felt that a part of that to me struck me as being racialized. That may not have been the case, but that is how I felt. Because I spent, like I say, almost a month in Africa, and I think that if the story wasn't ready to run or it needed more work, I wish that my editor could have talked to me about what he or she felt it needed to make it better. But just to dump it, I felt it was just dumped at the bottom of the page just to get it over with. So I remember that clearly. I felt it's just being something that I felt, and I felt just some race and some devaluing of who I was and a devaluing of my contribution.
We have organizing base and community base that expects the content that we put out, and so we don't have, the traditional issues around censorship. As we are a nonprofit, our issues are more about, did what we put out make a funder upset or something like that. It's Black people talking about Black issues, doing Black things, and so we don't have the pressures of a traditional newsroom or a traditional editorial board. In the past 10 years, we have watched an effective takeover of newsrooms from corporate billionaires who have literally bought out smaller magazines, smaller cable shows, smaller independent news stations, and even large ones, right? So like just this week we learned about like BuzzFeed News closing down. So a lot of these corporate owners got irritated and upset about the type of news that was being pushed out, and so they decided to like own these newsrooms. And here, in Pittsburgh, the issue that happened with one of the papers here, with Alexis and pushing her out, these conservative corporate business owners are really not invested in the universal stories of Blackness. They're invested in a specific, minuscule narrative, and so they're making it difficult for Black people to do their jobs, to tell actual stories about our lives, and to give people a real look at Black life. And I think that is the biggest threat, is this corporate takeover of media. We're still responding to the negative that's been put out there about Black people, right? So you can think about how Toni Morrison said the function of racism is distraction. We're not just able to create. We're usually having to be intentional about the stories that are pushing out. And I think that is kind of the issue. Like there's such a deficit when it comes to coverage for Black people, that even if you're just like, I just want to tell a story of Black life, you still have to be mindful that you have to respond to other stereotypes that are out there. I think that's what makes it difficult, no matter what type of genre you're in. Dedicate resources to what's going on in your community, right? Don't always just try to do the stereotypical story. And even when the stereotypical story occurs, try to figure out what were the circumstances that happened and went into things, right? What caused this one particular person to behave this way, to say this thing, to do this thing. Diversify your coverage, and it's not just like talking about the type of Black people, but also the events of Black people. Like, is it a concert? Is it a march? Is it an art show? Is it an investment? Is it a discovery? Showcase the diversity of Blackness that is in your neighborhood. When you have only one narrative being taught, everyone after you thinks, oh, this is what I need to do to be successful, right? I know we've moved away from the term like yellow journalism, but the whole, if it bleeds, it leads, right? That is something that has been recycled down and down and down. And so that's what journalists are taught to do, right? But if you have a diverse news theme, you have somebody talking about happy stories, somebody doing public interest stories, somebody doing health stories, and you're able to push and support and promote that information until it becomes successful. It harms people. Not only it stunts people from professionally developing, but it actually harms the communities that are being covered. So most of my stuff, it's mostly been white, right? Sometimes I was interning, there were like other people who look like me, but most of the professionals, mostly your direct supervisors, are white. So I very rarely, I think this is the first time I've had a black boss. When I was in Atlanta, where I'm from, it was more diverse. It had, Asian bosses, black bosses, white bosses, Jewish bosses, but mostly in Pittsburgh, it's mostly been Caucasian. I was interning at the public defender's office. I got done doing an argument, and I was sitting with my colleagues, and this other, I believe he was Italian, but it was an older white gentleman, brought up a piece of paper. He was a defense attorney. He threw this paper at me and said, "Go fetch." And I was just like, I was like, I'm not going to do this, right? I would be in court, and I would go back up, and they'd be like, "Oh, we're not talking to defendants right now." And I'm like, I literally just argued a motion in front of you 15 minutes ago, right? And so I understood, like, how it felt to be dehumanized as a person coming through the justice system, because here I am as an actual advocate, a certified legal intern, and people keep repeatedly thinking that I am the defendant, that I am the person or the defendant's wife or girlfriend, right? And I'm like, no, I'm actually the attorney, and so that is some of the things that you go through. I've been invited to events to represent official organizations and have been ignored. Like, people won't check me in. I was at an event downtown. They were like, they were premiering these like little snow globe things they do in Market Square, and everybody who was coming for official visit was supposed to get food tickets, and they would not give me a food ticket because they thought I was just like a beggar or somebody in Market Square. And I was just like, I'm here dressed in my business casual. So like, it is very difficult. Like, in the cities, you get a lot of microaggressions. But that's some of the stuff like I've just experienced, just some of the work that I do.
I returned home from Dayton, Ohio, and got the job as the managing editor. So I kind of had already known them a little bit, but I just, I applied for the job, it was open, and became the managing editor. So I write, edit, mentor freelance writers, stuff like that. So that's how I got in there, just kind of just applying and just happened to get the job. I definitely think, there could be more diversity. I've seen African Americans at, obviously the Courier, it's a black publication. Pretty much everybody's African American there. I've seen African Americans in my radio positions in Columbus and Dayton, Cleveland. There weren't too many African Americans on 92.3 The Fan. I think there were about 3 out of maybe 15 or 20 people on 92.3 The Fan in Cleveland. And right now, KDKA has me, Chris Moore, Lynne Hayes-Freeland, Paul Zeiss, Jamal Woodson. I think diversity is always a challenge, especially if it's not a medium that's catered to African Americans, such as hip hop radio or the black press. So it's definitely a challenge. But I'm hopeful that managers continue to do their best to find a diverse set of people to work. You have to reflect the community that you reflect in. When you have a diverse newsroom, and that means a newsroom can properly cover all angles of a particular story and not miss any angles due to a lack of diversity. So, if you're reporting on gun violence, or if you're reporting on something of the sort, and that affects African Americans, you definitely want to have a diverse newsroom, so that you don't always want to be discussing
topics about ethnic groups, but you do not have that type of representation in your newsroom. It's always better to have a diverse newsroom because the news affects all ethnicities. So if the news affects all ethnicities, then newsrooms and people covering the news should be of a wide array of ethnicities. That's only the right way to do things. And I mean, that should be with pretty much any profession, but especially in something as influential as the media. The first thing you have to have is a commitment. So similar to if you're trying to, eat healthier, you have to have a commitment first to wanting to eat healthier. First thing is a commitment to diversity. And so many companies, whether it's here in Pittsburgh, Duquesne Light, PNC Bank, so news organizations, local and national, have to make that commitment first within themselves. And once they make that commitment within themselves, then they will be able to reach out, as I mentioned, to different, Black-led nonprofit organizations, Black media, do advertising. You gotta have that commitment and reach out and bring more minorities, younger minorities into the fold early on and show them that you are an inclusive organization. For me, I have not faced too many challenges because I primarily worked in like the black media with the New Pittsburgh Courier. And as far as KDK Radio, I've had no challenges at all. I think overall, though, what I can say is overall, African American journalists have to work harder to sometimes, get exclusive stories or, be on the inside, more often if a lot of the parties that you're interviewing or covering, say, are not African American. Sometimes people are more comfortable with their own race. So sometimes African American journalists just have to work a little bit harder to gain, people's trust so that they can break exclusive stories, etc. Sometimes that is the case. Overall.
Yeah, let me start with the newsroom. We have started a diversity scholarship program where we recruit students from high school in the region. You have to be a person of color. You have to be going to college for journalism, and you get a summer internship here at the Trib every summer in our newsroom until you graduate. It's paid. And then on top of that, you get a $7,500 scholarship each year, so all 4 years. And then you're offered a job upon graduation. And the belief here was that was a way to find homegrown talent, people that might just stick around. Sometimes when news outlets hire diverse candidates, that they don't stay very long, or they come here and they don't like the region and they stay for a year and leave. But if we try to find people who are from here who then want to work here, that maybe we could build something that's a little more long term. So that is something that the Trib is involved in now, and we're hoping that will pay dividends. It will not, those people won't be hired here right away because they have to go to college, but maybe it's a way to really build something. And we're doing this every year. So we're on our third round of students, and so we have somebody who's coming back for his third year from Slippery Rock. We have 2 people that are coming back for their second year, and then we have a new person from Bethel Park High School who starts in June. And then as far as coverage, we are working on ways to find people or find assignments in various neighborhoods that are diverse. And what we want to do is have reporters not just drop in there and write stories and leave. We want them to become ingrained in various areas and get to know people, even go out there and don't even write a story, just like find out, who lives there, what are the businesses, who are some of the key players, or who are the people who have lived there for a long time and know the ins and outs of the neighborhoods. A lot of criticism that we've received, and when I say we, I don't mean just the Trib, I mean local media, is that we only go into like a Homewood or Hill District for a crime, and we only write about crime there, but we don't write about good things that are happening. And again, the theme was be deliberate. We have to be deliberate in changing that. And again, that's not something that's going to happen overnight, because you have to gain trust. You have to show your face and show that you're sincere. So you can't just do that in a day. That takes months or even years. So we're not very diverse at all, although I will say our executive editor is Puerto Rican, Luis Fabregas. And we have a lot of women reporters and women editors, and our CEO is a woman. But we definitely need more people of color. So on top of the internship, every time we have an opening, we try to reach out to the National Association of Black Journalists. We try to make sure we interview diverse candidates. But it's a slow process, and we are not very diverse at all right now. I don't know that we have enough voices right now to help balance out some of our ideas, or help other editors and reporters look at issues from a different angle or a different perspective. And that's why it's so important to have diversity in Newsroom. And I think you need more people in leadership as well. There aren't enough hours in the day to cover everything we want to cover. The industry in general is shrinking. And we are, here we're trying to cover a large metro region with a smaller staff. And there's just time is a big problem, and noise are my two biggest obstacles. And bodies, getting enough reporters to cover everything. Just sometimes you really can't get to a story because you just don't have a person who's available to do it. With George Floyd, I think that it opened our eyes. We covered the protests here and everything that happened. But we also, kept the former mayor in check. Like when he was using tear gas, and they were saying that they weren't using tear gas, we definitely knew that they were, and we kept them honest. We reported the truth, and honestly, George Floyd is what initially created the idea here for the scholarship. We were like, what can we do that's not like just like words? What can we do that's tangible? Like not just say, we're gonna increase our diversity within our staff. No, we actually said, how can we do this and make it permanent and make it lasting? And that was the idea that our CEO came up with. We also created a in-house diversity committee that meets once a month just to talk about these issues that I'm talking to you about.
Once again, I want to thank Lynne Hayes-Freeland, Dr. Ervin Dyer, Miracle Jones, Rob Taylor Jr., and Ben Schmitt. That was our podcast programming for today. I'm Justin Stewart. You've been listening to a conversation about race, ethnicity, equality, diversity, and inclusion in the newsroom, specifically newspapers and television. Have a great rest of your day.